I know it's been a while since I pretty much posted a video on here, and I'm so sorry for that. I'm still reading The Count of Monte Cristo, and I'm trying to pretty much take in every single ounce of detail when it comes to this book. But I wanted to go ahead and make this video and give a bookish pet peeve of mine. And one of those pet peeves is that I love retcons when it comes to certain materials, but not exactly when it comes to novels. And what do I mean by this? Well, first of all, in order to understand what a retcon is, we have to look at the definition. And just like the definition says here, it's a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events, typically used to facilitate a dramatic plot shift or account for an inconsistency. Basically what that means is that it's new information that's been added to the old material, so that way it can pretty much make sense of why that thing happened, and therefore that's the new continuity. For example, in the Sherlock Holmes stories The Final Problem, this was supposed to be the intended death of Sherlock Holmes, mainly because the author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, despite the fact that this detective has been making him a lot of money and has pretty much made him the most popular writer of the time, wanted to focus on other aspects of writing, mostly historical fiction. And Doyle kept to his word and wouldn't write any stories about Sherlock Holmes for almost a decade until he finally caved in and decided to write a story called The Hound of the Baskervilles, which took place before The Final Problem. And then finally, a year later, he wrote The Adventures of the Empty House, which serves as a retcon for the disappearance of Sherlock Holmes and his supposed death. To which Sherlock wasn't actually dead, he faked his death because of the fact that even though Moriarty was dead, his other agents were after him. But not only was this story important because it brought Sherlock Holmes back from the dead, but it also shows when done right, retcons can actually work with other stories. And hell, when it comes to Star Wars, whether it's the novels, the comics, or even the TV shows or the movies, they literally retcon their stuff all the time. And in my opinion, sometimes retcons can make the stories or the franchises a little bit more interesting the more you go back and read them. And then you notice the subtle differences there, big or small. But don't get me wrong, not every retcon is good. Like, let's take Who Censored Roger Rabbit as an example. Now, you guys have heard me talk about this book because I did an audiobook review about this like a couple months ago. And in that review, I talked about how I was pleasantly surprised by the differences between this book and Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Because while Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a live-action animated hybrid that was supposed to be a noir style that appeals to both adults and kids, the book it was based off of was completely different. Like, the concept of a murder mystery is the same, but the character's personality as well as the suspects as well as how the world is shaped is completely different. And how Tatoons communicate with people in the real world is also completely different. Instead of them just talking to humans face to face like you would a normal person, their words come out in comics book style bubble format. Long story short, even though that the book is completely different from the movie that we all grew up with and we're all familiar with, the book is interesting in itself to where it takes place in its own world and has its own certain style to it. But the problem comes in to where after the release of the movie, because as you know, when Who Framed Roger Rabbit hit the screens, it literally became a smash hit, becoming one of the most celebrated films of all time, and in my opinion, is what spearheaded the Disney Renaissance. But unfortunately, the author of the original book, Gary K. Wolfe, was also inspired by the movie, which prompted him to write this, Who Pugged Roger Rabbit. And I'm gonna be real with you guys, this was the first book that I DNF'd this year. Like, I didn't even know where to begin with this book. First things first, it's a retcon. A bad one at that. Unlike The Empty House, this particular novel was trying to combine elements from both the Roger Rabbit film as well as the Roger Rabbit from the book. The most notable difference is that Roger is completely different from his character from the book, and he follows more of his character from the film itself. The best way that people said to look at this novel is to try to think of it more as like you're watching Looney Tunes. The characters are familiar and you know who they are, but the situation that they're in is different. You know, now that I think about it, and that there were Roger Rabbit shorts that came out during the time when the book came out, that makes almost too much sense. But what the book was is that it was a Frankenstein monster trying to clash two different styles together into one novel, and neither one of them work. And what makes the book a retcon is that Jessica Rabbit literally dreamed up the events of this book in chapter 12. So take that for what you will. Another classic example of a retcon would have to be the character of Zorro, who originally appeared in a book called The Curse of Capistrano back in 1919. But then in 1920, when Douglas Fairbanks made his debut in the Mark of Zorro film, Johnston McCulley saw how popular the movie was getting, and he decided to change the title from The Curse of Capistrano to, of course, The Mark of Zorro. And since then, the name stuck. Not only did that title change help sell McCulley's books, but he also used Douglas Fairbanks' name in his next Zorro story, which is The Further Adventures of Zorro, in order to sell more books. What further makes this into a retcon is that the villain of the first book, Capitan Ramon, was supposedly supposed to be killed by Zorro himself. But then he shows back up again in this story and is working with pirates in order to get revenge on Zorro and steal away his fiance. And I don't mean like the villain died under mysterious circumstances. I mean Zoro literally ran him through the heart with his sword. In my opinion, the better example of a retcon to a classic character would have to be, of course, Isabella Allende's Zoro, because they managed to do the one thing that not a lot of Zoro stories do and actually explore the origins of the character himself. And not only use historical elements to paint the world that Diego de la Vega is a part of, but also uses certain callbacks and certain other materials from other Zoro stories in the mythos in order to try to cultivate this story and to try to build up this character. So like I said, if done correctly, a retcon can actually make the story or the franchise a lot more interesting depending on what information is given, thereby keeping the story and the franchise a bit more fresh. But if you're an author that wrote something that's fascinating and original, and you see a more popularized adaptation of your work to where you try to capitalize it and try to make something that can sell to the audience of that adaptation, it'll just come off as confusing. But hey, that's my Bookish rant of today, and what do you guys think? And what's your favorite retcon? Be it a TV show, book, movie, whatever it is, leave it down in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.